This tutorial is intended to do a deep dive into the standard functionality relating to accounts payable in SAP S/4HANA. I will use the very latest Fiori apps where possible, but on occasion may include the odd classic GUI transaction for information. Many companies have migrated from previous SAP systems and have certain processes in place that they don't want to change. So in addition to the official SAP best practice, I do cover some alternatives. Although I go into the detail to demonstrate, for example, how to post or pay an invoice, I also cover the whys and wherefores so that both managers and end users can understand the whole flow in detail and the importance of not just pushing an invoice through for payment, but also taking care that the correct process is followed to ensure that areas such as the accruals, costs and stocks are also updated correctly. SAP S/4HANA is changing at a very fast pace, so even as I speak, new functionality is appearing. You may find, therefore, that your system looks slightly different, so I will indicate the Fiori app ID I'm using where relevant and show you how to check this on your system and in the Fiori apps library. Sometimes I mention that a certain functionality is not currently available, but by the time you watch this tutorial, this may have changed, so it's worth double checking. A few words about me before we start. My name is Una Flanagan, and I've been implementing and supporting SAP for over 2 decades, although I have worked mainly on S/4HANA over the last few years. I spent many years working in accounts payable and receivable as well as finance generally, so understand finance from both a user perspective and as an SAP consultant. I've also written a few books, 3 of them on S/4HANA, as well as various training courses, blogs and webinars. The tutorial is split into 7 main sections, and each section is further split into subsections. The first section will introduce SAP S/4HANA and Fiori and talk a little bit about the SAP best practices. The next section will explain the organisational structure and the different types of master data that you might come across in accounts payable and how it all works in Fiori, in particular supplier master data. The third section explains the procure-to-pay process, so that when posting a supplier invoice, you understand the related documents and under which circumstances it may be automatically blocked for payment. I included this section because understanding a little about purchase orders will help you to understand the most efficient way to enter an invoice and also to troubleshoot any discrepancies. You may need to know why the invoice behaves differently if the purchase order has goods receipt-based invoice verification selected, for example, and what to do with service entry sheets or limit purchase orders. The fourth section explains the different types of invoice and credit notes and how to post them. It's important to choose the correct type of credit note, as this has repercussions on what is posted or not posted to the GR/IR account. The fifth section explains what the GR/IR account is, how it works and how to maintain it. Although reconciling the GR/IR account is maybe a bit advanced for a normal accounts payable processor and is perhaps more of a finance or general ledger task, I felt it was important to include it here to show what happens to the other side of an invoice after it's been posted, as well as emphasise how important it is to make adjustments and post credit notes correctly. Also in this section we'll cover some of the new tools to monitor and reconcile the GR/IR account. In the sixth section, we start by talking about some preparations that you can do prior to running the automatic payment program in order to avoid having too many exceptions during the proposal stage. We go through the various steps of the automatic payment run and then cover several other ways to make payments, including manual and down payments. We explain how the bank clearing accounts and bank reconciliation work, as well as the postings and clearing. We run through some related reports, and we cover some tips and tricks. Finally, there's quite a large section on troubleshooting the automatic payment program. And the 7th section is all about closing and reporting. Where possible, I will demonstrate using a 1909 SAP S4HANA system and SAP Fiori apps. I will explain later in this section what those terms mean. Note that if you're not currently using Fiori, most of the processes are similar and you'll be able to follow much of the tutorial using classic GUI transactions, but you won't have access to some of the functionality, including some of the new Fiori reports. The master data and transactions, usually the same fields are mandatory and mean the same thing, but the layout may be different in Fiori and the classic GUI transactions. As you can see from the agenda, this section is mostly introducing SAP S4HANA and Fiori. I will give a little background and explain the different versions of SAP S4HANA and what the SAP best practices are. Then I have a couple of quick demos on navigating around the SAP Fiori Launchpad and apps, plus a demo showing some tips and tricks before we go properly into accounts payable in the next section. Just in case you're not convinced about using Fiori, when you can still use the GUI in S4HANA on-premise, I've done a quick comparison of one app in Fiori and its equivalent in the GUI. When I talk about S4HANA, I usually start by saying that in the past, SAP was traditionally known for its flexibility. You could tailor the standard SAP system in a number of different ways to do exactly what you wanted, and if that wasn't enough, you could add bits of your own code in places to enhance it further. This meant, however, that implementing and maintaining the system could get quite complex. There was never sufficient time or resources to swap the old setup with the new functionality issued by SAP, and a lot of regression testing each time any upgrades were planned. Historically, systems were either designed to be efficient for users to enter transactions, known as online transaction processing or OLTP, or they were designed for users to extract data easily in the form of reports, known as Online Analytical Processing or OLAP, but not both. Hence, many organisations used to transfer all the data to a separate system for reporting, often overnight, so at month end you might have to wait 24 hours for adjustments to show in the more complex reports. Thanks to advances in technology and the new in-memory HANA database, SAP were able to create S4HANA. Although many of the processes appear quite similar, the in-memory part makes it super fast, and the new design of the database itself means that it's efficient for both transactions and real-time reporting. In addition, S4HANA is all about simplification and returning to a consistent best practice way of doing things, improving many processes, and bringing a lot of new improved functionality. There are two main types of SAP S4HANA, plus a number of permutations in between. On the one hand, you have the S4HANA Cloud Essentials, traditionally known as SAP S4HANA Public Cloud, which is run on a centrally administered, multi-tenanted system using only Fiori. SAP is responsible for all the software, hardware, maintenance, backups, etc., making it much cheaper and easier for individual organisations. However, quarterly upgrades are mandatory, and there's less flexibility to customise the system. On the other hand, you have essentially a very similar version, but where you're in full control. For example, you choose where it's hosted, when upgrades are carried out, how it's maintained, and you're responsible for the software and hardware and can choose whether to use Fiori or not. This is now called S/4HANA Any-Premise, but as it was previously always known as On-Premise, you'll still see the abbreviation OP for On-Premise in SAP documentation. Each version of S/4HANA is named after the year and month of its release. The version I will be using for most of the demonstrations is the 1909 S/4HANA Any-Premise version. In other words, it was released in September 2019. Its predecessor was 1809, released in September 2018. And its successor will probably be released in 2020, although I believe the naming convention may be changing to show simply the year for on-premise releases. Even though I'm using an on-premise system, for the most part the processes and transactions should look fairly similar in Fiori, even if you're using S/4HANA Cloud. However, the speed of innovation is very fast at the moment, so sometimes I may be using an earlier or later version of a transaction. SAP Best Practices is not just a general indication of the best way to do something, but a very specific, carefully documented set of processes and related information, grouped and published under numbered scope items. The SAP Best Practices Explorer has all the detail about each practice. You choose the release, for example, SAP S/4HANA On-Premise 1909, as well as the related country, and then the scope item. The scope items form part of the building blocks which enable a lot of automation during a new S/4HANA implementation. The main scope item for accounts payable is J60, and we'll be covering most of the J60 processes in this tutorial. The Best Practices Explorer can currently be found at the link on the slide. So now to get to the more fun stuff. Fiori is the name of the new user interface, or as SAP prefer to call it, user experience. In other words, how you access S/4HANA. Fiori is also the Italian word for flowers, in case you're wondering. The desktop or Fiori launchpad contains individual tiles called Fiori apps, which take you into the relevant sections. Fiori apps can represent transactions, for example posting an invoice or payment, fact sheets, for example about supplier information, or analytics such as KPIs and reports. By the way, they don't actually tumble in real life, as I'll show you shortly in a demo. Although there are currently around 12,000 Fiori apps in the Fiori library, the actual number of apps you're likely to use on a daily basis is probably very small, and your homepage should only contain those apps that you'll need. That said, because I'm working in many areas, you can see from the slide that in addition to a short example homepage, I've created many additional tabs to quickly access groups of apps that I've put together, although I can also access the standard SAP groups. If you're used to previous versions of SAP with the classic GUI menu, you may have used a more complicated menu structure, like on the right of the slide, to access transactions and reports, and you probably have logged on using a GUI launchpad. Some transaction codes are quite short and easy to remember, or you could save them in your favourites folder. However, some transactions can be quite long, and to search the menus to launch a transaction if it's not in your favourites is quite time consuming. You usually need quite a number of keystrokes to find the transaction, then enter the selection criteria and finally execute it. When you go into Fiori, you arrive first at your home page, which will typically contain just the transactions or apps you most use. Depending on the transaction, you'll already be able to see some figures at a glance without a single keystroke. Some transactions in Fiori do still call a classic GUI transaction code and look very similar to the GUI transaction, but many are completely new and rewritten specifically for S/4HANA. By the way, I'm using Fiori 3, so if you're using an earlier version, you may see slight differences. For example, to edit the home page, you need to click on the little Me area or person icon, which is on the right in Fiori 3, but on the left in earlier versions of Fiori. Also, you can now use the SAP logo instead of the home icon in certain places to navigate back to the home page. I'm now going to do a short demo of the Fiori Launchpad. As mentioned before, when I log in, I arrive first at the home page, but can easily move to other groups using the tabs. To get back to the home page quickly, I can click on the Home button, or in some cases, I can click on the SAP logo. The reason that you only see my homepage apps on my homepage and not the other groups is that I've changed the homepage setting in the Me area to show one group at a time, mainly because I have so many apps and groups that it takes forever to load the homepage if I don't. I can still jump to the groups quite quickly using the tabs or the down arrow on the right. To launch an app that's not on my home page, I can use the tabs to go to that group to find the app, or I can use the down arrow on the right to go to the group. To edit the groups, I can go to Settings and choose Edit Homepage. I can create, rearrange and delete groups here, as well as rename both the groups and the apps. If I don't like the name of an app, or want to add something to it, for example, I want to remember that on the Supplier Balances app, I can also drill down to the line items. I can click on the three dots at the bottom right of the tile to edit the information, and edit the description or add another line to the name of the app. Sometimes editing the homepage can be slow, so I usually find it easier to go to the App Finder, where I can find and add apps quickly without going into Edit Homepage, and I can also create new groups here, although I can't choose which order I want them to appear in here. I will go now to the App Finder using the Me icon. If I know the name of the app I'm looking for, I can enter all or part of it in the Search in Catalogue field, for example, Supplier Balances. When searching globally for something, remember always to make sure that All is selected on the left-hand side and not the last catalogue that you looked at. The apps are grouped together in catalogues, so if I don't know the name of the app, then I can search in the most likely catalogue down the left-hand side, but I have to clear the search field first. I use a lot of catalogues, but you probably won't see anywhere near as many. If you have the Fiori App ID, you can also check in the Fiori Apps library which catalogue it belongs in. I can click on an app to go directly into it, but then I'll have to search for it again next time. So usually I will add it either to my home page or to one of my groups or tabs. If I choose the Automatic Payments app and click on the little pin, and scroll down, you can see that I've already added this to my AP Payments group, where I've gathered together all the apps that relate to the payment program. I can add and remove an app to and from one or more groups here, and I can also create a new group by clicking on New Groups at the top, in which case it will either appear right after my other custom groups, or, depending on the release, it will appear at the bottom of all the other groups. And if I want to move it, I'll have to go into Edit Homepage. To go back to the home page, I click on the SAP logo. The apps can be rearranged how I want. I can rearrange the tiles by dragging them, so that, for example, all my favourites are at the top, or I can group similar things together. I'm now going to do a quick demo of some functionality that appears in a lot of the apps, although I will go into more detail when we get to the individual apps. To go into a transaction, I simply click on the tile. I will use the app called Display Supplier List as an example, as we will see this app a lot later. First of all, I will check the app ID by going to Settings and selecting About. I can see that the app ID is F1861. Although the new apps mostly have a 5 or 6 digit ID beginning with F, note that not all apps have such an ID. Apps that run a GUI transaction, for example, have the GUI transaction code instead. And not all apps have the same naming convention. For example, Web Dimpro apps are more complicated. This slide shows the link to the Fiori apps library, which we will see in more detail in a second. If I now go to the Fiori app library, I usually select either All Apps or All Apps for S4HANA. Then I can either search by name or App ID, which is usually better as it's shorter and ensures that you have exactly the correct app, as sometimes the name changes or several apps have similar names. As you can see, this app has the same ID that we just saw in the Fiori Launchpad, in other words F1861. First thing to check is that it's relevant to your system. At the top you can see whether it's S4HANA or S4HANA Cloud, and if you click on the Implementation Information tab, you can check the exact release. Also useful for your support department, on the Implementation Information tab, you can see all the implementation and configuration information, as well as the business roles and catalogues that it appears in, and any related apps. Depending on the app, you may find further information in the Product Features tab, such as links to app documentation or on occasion tutorials, although they are mostly for S4HANA Cloud versions of apps. During the course, whenever I mention a Fiori app ID, I will try to either give the app ID or the transaction code so that you can check whether you're using the same app, or to help you find further information about the app in the library. Whilst we're in the library, you can also select the list view to see the apps in list format, which may be easier for you, depending what you're searching for. You can use the filters at the top. For example, if I go into the role option at the top and select the Accounts Payable Accountant role, I can see which transactions are assigned to that role. There is also a Settings button on the right to add additional columns or remove existing ones. Back to the app itself. Many apps have a similar sort of layout. The filter bar at the top contains the selection criteria. The little icon at the right of the field is the drop-down. For example, if I click on the Country drop-down, I can choose countries. I can also use the Define Conditions tab for more advanced searching. If I want to use different selection criteria, I can click on the Adapt Filters button, and clicking on the More Filters button gives me more options. To choose, I just select the box. For example, Created By now appears on the menu. I can save this selection criteria as a variant. I can hide and display the filter bar by using the up and down arrows, and I can also pin it at the top in some places so that it stays even when you scroll. The little share button at the top right allows you to send as email or save as a tile. If I click on the question mark or help icon, I can get further information on the marked fields, and clicking on the circle gives more detail where available. This is a new feature in the on-premise system, and you may not see it if you have an earlier release. Most apps start with an overview screen in the format of a table. Some allow me to then create and maintain data or drill down into more detail. Although I can usually sort and filter a column by clicking on the header, the Settings button is more flexible and allows me to add fields as well. To add a field, I select the box to the left and use the arrows at the top to position it in the order that I want. I can go to the Sort tab and sort on multiple fields at once. And in the Filter tab, I can use various conditions to filter by on fields, including or excluding fields. The Group tab allows to group by field. In some other apps that we'll see later, I can form a kind of hierarchy or tree by grouping several fields at once. Here I will group by country. If I have a preferred layout, I can save it as a variant and choose whether it's public or just for me, as well as whether it should be my default layout. To the right of the Settings button is the Export to Excel button. This exists in many apps, although not always in the same position. If I want to see more detail about a supplier, I can click on the dark blue supplier number. A pop-up appears with an option to jump directly to that supplier in another app, for example supplier balances. If the app I want does not appear in the list, I can go to More Links and select the app there so that it appears next time in the pop-up box. Clicking on the blue supplier number instead of an app takes me to the supplier fact sheet, which shows transactions and master data for that supplier, and I will go into more detail on the fact sheet in the section under Supplier Master Data. To get back to the Display Supplier app, I just click on the back arrow. In this demo, I will show you some more useful functionality or tips for working with Fiori. I'm going back into Settings, where I can change things like the appearance or colour. We have already seen that you can show one or all groups on your home page. If you have a lot of groups, your home page will be slower to load if you choose all content. The most useful functionality that I use here is the default values, used mainly by the filter bars in some of the apps. Of course, this works best if you work with the same items each time. For example, 1 or 2 company codes or 1 cost centre, but there are quite a lot of values that may be useful if you scroll down. Note that although it will only allow you to physically type in or select one value in the field and drop down, you can click on additional values to choose a range, or list several values using the condition equal to and the plus button to add more. Note that although many apps use the defaults, they don't make sense in all cases. In this particular case, I'm taking out the second company code as it is in a different currency, and I've been getting errors where, for example, a report can't work with 2 companies in different currencies. There are a couple of other ways to search for something. If I go to the home page, I can click on Home and then Homepage Apps, and in some cases can jump to groups or apps quickly here. However, a good way to find something, regardless of whether it's an app, master data, or transactional data, is to use the Enhanced Search button, which has a certain intelligence, almost like Google in that it can look for similar terms. If, for example, I enter supplier but with just one P, you'll see it finds the word supplier everywhere, even though it's misspelt. I can search absolutely everywhere, or I can restrict the search. If I just enter, for example, 123, it will show everywhere that 123 appears. As you can see, that includes document numbers, references, texts in a purchase requisition, the number of a service entry sheet, and so on. However, I can restrict the drop-down of the Enhanced Search to just apps. I can further filter the items in the tab, for example, to find only journal entries with 123, and there are other items in the drop-down. If I select banks, you can see it only shows the one bank, but also updates the top drill down to banks. I can click on the arrow on the right to open up the detail of the bank. If I change the top drop down to, for example, journal entries, then I'll only see journal entries. I can click on the Show Filter button, and the number of occurrences of the search for 123 are summarised by area. So, for example, there are 6 journal entries that contain 123 in them somewhere. If I scroll further down, I can restrict the search further to, for example, a specific company code or document type. I can export the results to Excel, or if I click on Sort, you can see more options. Finally, I can display the results in a table, switch off the filter, and even use the Settings button to change the table columns. If you're surprised that I'm doing this tutorial using Fiori apps rather than the traditional GUI transactions, I just thought I'd do a quick illustration comparing the classic GUI transaction for the automatic payment program with the Fiori app for the same thing. If you're already familiar with the GUI transaction F110, you'll notice that the Fiori app follows essentially the same process. In other words, you create a proposal, review, and if necessary edit it, post it, and produce a payment media. Indeed, if you create a payment run using the Fiori app, you'll also be able to see it in the GUI transaction. However, the app has a number of key advantages, which I'll highlight in a sneak preview of the payment program app in Fiori. More details will follow in section 6 on payments. To identify a payment run in the GUI, you combine the run date together with the 5-digit ID, but it's difficult to search on anything else. This is okay if you maybe only have one company code or a very robust naming convention, but often people don't. Unlike in the app, you cannot search by company code, payment media, or creator, which can be useful in test systems or troubleshooting. And even searching by status if you're trying to find open payment proposals can sometimes be difficult. In this slide, you see the equivalent functionality in the Fiori app, Manage Automatic Payments, F0770. You have a neat filter bar at the top, so you can, for example, select a date range and only payments created by a specific user, or for certain company codes. You can already see without going into the payment program which payment method the run was for, as well as the run date, posting date, and the payment status. The ID still exists, but is less critical now that you have other criteria to search by. There are even separate tabs to group the different statuses together. You can also see which payment runs have payment media created. It's then very simple to drill down into the details of the payment run by clicking on the small blue arrow on the right. The additional log button in the app is much simpler than the entire tab in the classic GUI transaction. And not everybody knows that in the GUI transaction, if you fill in the vendor numbers here, you get a lot more information in the log than if you leave those fields blank. In this slide, you see the parameters for the payment run, which are all in one place, compared to the GUI, where they're spread over several different tabs. And here you have one simple button for the additional log. I think that on almost every new SAP project, I've been asked how to block multiple invoices for payment in one go. And I have to explain you can only block them all, or one at a time in the payment proposal. Plus you lose them all and have to redo it if you rerun the proposal. Or you have to use mass change and block them in the line items before running the proposal. And remember to manually unblock them afterwards. In the Fiori app, it's very simple to select as many or as few as you want, and block and unblock them with a single click. In the Fiori app, you can easily block a number of items at the same time by just selecting the box to the left of each item. You can also use the Settings button for advanced filtering to select a number of items quickly, for example by dates, document types, discounts, etc. You can also unblock certain types of blocks directly in the payment program. Troubleshooting is quicker. For example, you can click on either the blue vendor number or the blue document number to drill down into the supplier or the document for further information. The log is easy to read, and you can drill down on some of the messages for further information, and you can export the whole lot to Excel if you prefer. That's just the differences in one app, where the functionality is in fact very similar in Fiori. There are many other apps with better functionality, and also many new apps with functionality that doesn't even exist in the classic GUI, even in S/4HANA. So I hope you enjoy exploring everything to do with accounts payable in Fiori in the rest of the tutorial. In this section, I'm going to start by explaining a little about the organisational structure in both finance and purchasing, and the key organisational objects before going on to the different types of master data relevant to accounts payable, in particular the supplier master data. During this video, I'll be using the terms vendor and supplier interchangeably. SAP seems to be moving towards the term supplier, but vendor is still found in a number of places. I will explain how to create the master data directly in the system using Fiori apps for cases where you're responsible for maintaining the data directly, although organisations with central master data maintenance may have slightly different procedures. Here is a quick look at the agenda to see the sort of master data we'll be covering. We will start with organisational objects such as the company code, plants, and purchasing organisations, and I will explain why they're all needed. Then we'll look at the finance master data that's used when posting an invoice. Before we can create suppliers, we usually need to create bank master records, and I'll explain why shortly. I'll cover the difference between business partners and suppliers and the key fields involved in setting up a supplier, and then I'll do a short demo. Then we'll see a couple of unusual bits of functionality and look at some of the key reports related to supplier master data. At the end, as usual, I have a few tips and tricks. One of the most important objects in finance is the company code. Normally you would have one company code for each legal entity, but sometimes organisations may split legal entities further and consolidate them afterwards for legal reporting. When you receive a supplier invoice, for example, it can only be legally addressed to and posted into one company code, even if you later split it out or recharge the cost to other company codes in the same group. You may also have different purchasing organisations in one company code. For example, perhaps your stock purchasing is done by one part of the purchasing department, and non-stock handled quite differently by another, with different purchasing terms and conditions. Whereas the company code is based on legal reporting for finance purposes, the purchasing organisation groups together procurement requirements. For example, in order to get the best terms and conditions, one purchasing organisation may include all or part of several company codes. A purchasing group is just a group of individual purchasers. Finally, the location is handled by the term plant in S/4HANA. Whilst one plant typically equates to one factory, warehouse or delivery site, you can also set up plants for regional offices or branches or any other location. A plant can be shared across many areas in S/4HANA. For example, it can be used by purchasing, sales, production, and so on. There are two types of data, transactional and master data. Transactional data tends to be one-off postings at a specific date with values, for example, posting a goods receipt, invoice, journal entry or payment. Master data is created once but can be used by many transactions. It can change but usually does not change on a regular basis. When you enter a transaction, you do not need to re-enter certain data each time. For example, when entering a supplier invoice, you only need to enter the code for the supplier master record. You do not need to re-enter all the supplier master data for each transaction. Also, you only need to enter the number of the GL account master record. You do not need to tell the system each time what type of GL account it is, or any other details. Many organisations have a policy that most or all purchases are made via a purchase order, in which case the purchase order will already contain some master data, and either pass or map the relevant ones to finance automatically. However, where a purchase order is not raised and the invoice is posted directly, the person posting the invoice will have to fill in the codes for the finance master data manually. At a minimum, this is usually the general ledger, account, cost centre, and if necessary, an internal order or WBS element. Entering the supplier account will also link all the payment and address information to the invoice. When recording a supplier invoice, the purchase needs to be recorded in finance in several different ways. As a minimum, you need to know the what, in other words the type of cost, which is generally represented in finance by the general ledger account. You need to know the who, in other words which department is responsible, which is represented by the cost centre. Sometimes there are other requirements. For example, you may want to know which employee was travelling for travel expenses, as well as which department, or you may want to know which event a cost refers to, or which specific marketing campaign. If the costs are fairly simple, an organisation may set up an internal order to gather the costs either in parallel with the cost centre or prior to settling them to a cost centre. And if they're more complicated, a project may be set up which can be split up further into work breakdown structures, usually abbreviated to WBS elements, which can be set up in a hierarchical structure. These objects are usually known as cost assignment objects, and at least one is required for all primary and secondary costs, but not necessarily for non-operating costs, although those are not usually posted via an invoice anyway. There are other financial master data objects such as profit centres and segments, but these are generally derived automatically from other objects. Creating a material or product master record to enter in the purchase order means that you do not have to manually enter the description, finance details, valuation type, and a lot of other details each time. Also, the same material code can be used for a number of different areas: purchasing, sales, inventory, manufacturing, etc. Although we'll cover the purchase order in the next section, I'll just say a few words in the next slide about how the materials used in the purchase order. A supplier or vendor is a person or company that the organisation buys goods or services from. As previously mentioned, if you create a supplier master record, then you don't need to enter all the supplier details every time you enter a supplier invoice or credit note. You just enter the supplier account number or code. Similarly, each time you create a supplier master record, you don't have to enter all the bank details, just the code for the bank master record and the bank account number of the supplier. If an item goes into stock for production or resale, the code that's used in the system in order to record and track the item through production and to calculate the cost of sales, and so on, is called the material master or product code. SAP still uses both terms, product and material, so you may see them being used interchangeably in the tutorial. Typically, the name will be more precise than the product A, B and C shown in the slide, and will help you match the invoice with the purchase order and goods receipt line items. Material masters for stock items will contain all the relevant data for posting, such as a profit centre, links to the GL account, and so on, which are automatically transferred to accounting when you post the invoice. All stock invoices must go through the logistics invoice verification process. In other words, with a purchase order and goods receipt, in order to update the inventory and be available in other logistics transactions, such as goods receipts and goods issues to production or sales. Material codes are not mandatory in the purchase order for non-stock items. You can just use a text description instead, as shown in the table, but they can also be created for anything that's purchased regularly, even if not held in stock. You can also have service material codes, but you wouldn't typically bother with individual material codes, for example for general purchases like stationery, which vary a lot. Even for non-stock items, the GL account and cost objects can be either entered or derived on the purchase order and also transferred to the invoice. In addition, many organisations use purchase info records and contracts to set up prices and other information for combinations of suppliers and stock materials. If an invoice price doesn't match the purchase order and a mistake's not been made by the supplier, it may be necessary to go back and review and update the material and info records to prevent the error recurring. The slide shows the overview screen of an example list of supplier banks using the Manage Banks app F1574. Each time you create a new supplier, you need to tell the system certain information in order to pay them, such as which bank and which account number, unless of course you pay by cheque or the amount is collected by direct debit. Rather than entering the whole bank information every time you create a supplier, in S4HANA you set up each bank once and then just refer to it by a bank key in the supplier master record that uses it when you maintain the supplier bank account. There are several ways that you can do this if the bank does not already exist when you create the supplier. You can set up the bank master data in a separate transaction before you create the supplier master record, or you can create the bank from inside the supplier master record transaction. Alternatively, you can subscribe to a service that updates all the bank records for a country automatically, regardless of whether you actually use them. The bank key is the unique code that identifies a specific bank. As most organisations have to make some foreign payments, you will almost certainly have to set up some foreign banks as well as local. You can see some examples in the slide. In the UK, for example, the bank key is known as the bank sort code and is always 6 numerical characters, although other countries have different formats. As standard, the system should prevent you entering anything different to the correct bank key format for each country, although you can change the rules in the configuration if a format change occurs. Although many countries have a fixed format, some countries don't have any rule, and organisations may choose to use the SWIFT code or BIC as the bank key, but they could use any unique identifier. The SWIFT BIC code consists of a 4-letter bank code, often a shortened version of the bank name, followed by a 2-digit country code, then 2 digits for the head office location, and an optional 3 for the branch. To create a new bank using the Fiori app F1574, there's a Create Bank button at the bottom of the screen. Although the buttons should be harmonised between different apps, they still occasionally appear in different places depending on the app and version. Normally they should appear above the content of the table, i.e. just below the filters, so if you don't see it at the bottom, check above the table area, and also check for a plus sign if you don't see a Create button. Mandatory fields have a red asterisk, but I'm also going to fill in the SWIFT BIC code and the city. You could fill in the full address as well, but usually the city or branch is sufficient. There are other fields that can be used if the bank happens to be your own house bank, i.e. the bank that your organisation uses for trading, but that's rarely necessary for supplier purposes. I can search for the bank by entering the city or anything else in the filter bar. We can see that there are 2 banks in Chicago in this system. I decide to enter something in the branch field in case somebody searches on that instead of the city. I click on the blue part of the bank name and then select the Edit button at the bottom to make the change and save. If I want to change the layout of the table, I can use the Settings button to add fields such as Created By. I can also move the columns around by dragging and dropping them, or using the arrows in the Setting button. I can change the filter bar by going into the Adapt Filters button, and then More Filters and selecting the additional field. Now you can see the Created By button in the filter. The filter and settings functionality is similar in most apps, and I will expand on it a bit more in each app we look at. The term business partner encompasses a number of different relationships in terms of both the type of entity and the role. Business partner can be a person such as an employee or contact, and it can also be an organisation or group. The business partner may be somebody that you buy from, as well as somebody that you sell to. Some of the data, for example the name and address, will apply everywhere, and some information may only be required for specific areas of the business, such as finance or purchasing. And, for example, different company codes and purchasing organisations may have different terms and conditions for the same business partner. In SAP S/4HANA, rather than entering global data multiple times, for example by creating separate master data for suppliers and for customers, or for each company code or purchasing organisation, you create one global or general business partner role with additional roles as required. Roles can be for things like finance or company code data, purchasing, sales, credit management, collections management, plant and bank data, and so on. In SAP ERP, the business partner functionality was only mandatory if you were using, for example, FSCM credit management, and there were other options to maintain customers and vendors, such as the transactions XK01 and XK02 to create and amend vendors. In S/4HANA, the business partner functionality is the only option for customer and vendor master data maintenance, but it still links to the old customer and vendor master data tables and their related numbers, which are used in many transactions. If you're familiar with the transactions in SAP ERP, you could say that the generic 00000 BP role approximately equates to the general data section in the slide, and typically the FLVN00 vendor FI role equates to the company code data section, and the FLVN01 vendor MM equates to the purchasing organisation data section. Although the term vendor is used here and the term supplier is used with business partners, they both refer to the same concept, generally a person or organisation that you're buying something from. How this is organised in practice varies. An organisation may have one department responsible for all business partners, or have accounts payable responsible for suppliers and accounts receivable for customers. Or somebody creates a business partner centrally, and the accounts payable and receivable departments can extend the roles as required. If you have master data governance or MDG implemented, there may be different steps or forms to fill in, and some organisations may have workflows to ensure approvals and compliance. In this tutorial, I will only be covering the basic creation of the master data. Now we come to the different approaches to numbering. Numbering can be internal, in other words, sequentially assigned by the system, or external, in other words, the number is assigned manually or from an external system. An important point is that the business partner number does not have to be the same as the customer or vendor number, as technically they're different objects in SAP S/4HANA. If in your legacy system, let's say all the supplier numbers begin with 1 and the customer numbers begin with 2, whether you keep the same numbering approach in S/4HANA or not, you also have to decide on a numbering approach for the related business partner. You could change all the numbers so that everything begins with the same number, in other words, having one number range for both customers and suppliers. You could use a separate number range, beginning with 3, for the business partner master data maintenance, and keep the supplier numbers beginning with 1 and the customer with 2, although that could be confusing. For the purposes of master data maintenance, the business partner number will be the main number, but when running, for example, transactional reports, the supplier and customer numbers would be the main number. You can also have the customer business partners the same, i.e. supplier and related business partner begin with 1, and the customer and the related business partner begin with 2, with a link where an organisation is both a supplier and customer. But in this case, you'd have additional maintenance. I've used the classic GUI transaction BP in the slide, as it's easier to see the business partner, supplier and customer numbers all in one place. If you want to, for example, deduct the customer amount when paying the supplier, there's also a field to select for that in the company code role, if the two are linked. Or you could have various combinations. For example, having one business partner number range for all intercompany, regardless of whether customer or supplier, but separate number ranges for everything else. Some of this will be taken care of automatically by the configuration, and some relationships will need to be created in the business partner maintenance, which we will see shortly. Assuming you've used separate reconciliation accounts, you can anyway report different types of supplier separately, but you could also set different number ranges for different types of employee. For example, domestic, foreign, intercompany, and employee vendors. Payment terms can be set up in several different ways and need to be created in the configuration before they can be used. Both the buying organisation and the selling organisation will try to standardise the payment terms, with the one paying everybody as late as possible and the other receiving payment as soon as possible. So they'll have to come to a compromise, and the terms are usually agreed in writing beforehand. Usually organisations create payment terms for the most popular number of days, such as 15, 30, 45, 60 and 90. If an organisation tends to make payments on a certain day, e.g. middle of the month, payment terms can be created to reflect this, for example, 15 days after the end of the month. An organisation may have payment terms with a cash or early payment discount to encourage its customers to pay sooner, for example allowing the customer to deduct 2% if he pays within 10 days, but not allowing any deductions if he waits for 60 days. Payment terms are used by the payment program to identify what date to pay the supplier. This screen shows the first part of the additional detail for the company code. The correspondence section is for any communication with the supplier. The account at the supplier is the number that the supplier gives your organisation, and is sometimes useful information if you need to ring up the supplier with a query about an invoice or credit note. However, you can also use these fields in a standard form or letters you send to the supplier. Accounting clerks tend to be used more with accounts receivable. If you only have a small accounts payable department and the supplier accounts are shared amongst everyone, you may not need to use the accounting clerk's functionality. However, in a larger department where users are allocated specific accounts to take care of, an accounting clerk can be created for each user and assigned to the suppliers they're responsible for. The accounting clerk is used in a lot of reports and some transactions as well. Local processing is only relevant if the account is a head office, to indicate that the payment transactions and dunning notices, if relevant, should only be created for the branch instead of the head office, which is the default. The reconciliation account is the account in the general ledger which summarises all the supplier accounts. The most common reconciliation accounts are probably domestic, foreign and intercompany. But you can also set up additional ones, for example, for employees or one-time vendors, and even fixed asset or stock vendors. You can use the head office field to enter the account number of the head office if the supplier is a branch account. If this field is filled, then documents for the branch will still be posted to the head office account instead of the branch account, but they still keep the branch information. You can leave the sort key blank or choose one of the codes in the drop-down, for example 001, which is the posting date, or 002, which is the document number plus the fiscal year. There are quite a few to choose from, and you can also configure your own. The sort key is used for suppliers, customers and GL accounts. Depending on the code chosen, that field's then copied into the assignment field, giving you an extra functionality, for example allowing you to add fields that are not standard in a report, by using the assignment field instead to add columns or dimensions to reports. For example, there are fields in the sort codes key that don't exist in the Manage Supplier Line Items report, but the assignment field does exist, so you can use that instead. The certification date is used in the US for women and minority-owned businesses. The planning group is used for liquidity forecasting. Some examples of groups are domestic and foreign payments and receipts, affiliated vendors and customers, major or high risk, and so on. Payment methods are required if you're using the automatic payment program, and determine what type of media is produced and in what format, for example cheques or bank transfers. It can be useful, for example, if the supplier usually collects payments from you automatically. You could create and enter a dummy payment method so that you know that it's not the case that someone just forgot to enter a payment method and that you still need to pay the supplier. Any payment methods requiring a bank transfer will of course only work if you also supply the correct bank details, and the payment method needs to be compatible with those details and the currency. For example, you cannot use a SAP payment method without an IBAN, an international bank number, nor can you use SAP to pay GBP or BACS to pay euros. Note that the payment block key only blocks the automatic payment program and not invoices being posted. You can only block manual payments if you've configured a specific payment block for manual payments as well. If you don't want to set the alternative payee globally, you can set it here instead. There are different types of tolerance in SAP S/4HANA. Some are set at company code level and some are set at supplier level. Many organisations have a single standard tolerance group for most suppliers, but could have different tolerance groups for intercompany, or for example for stock and non-purchases as required. In this system I can leave both tolerance groups fields blank, not because I do not want a tolerance, but because I've created my standard tolerance group with a blank code so that if the field is not filled in, the standard tolerance is automatically used. The first tolerance group field, among other things, defines the maximum permitted payment or clearing difference in terms of either amount or percentage, and the second field, the invoice verification tolerance group, relates to invoices posted against a purchase order and is an overall invoice difference which cannot be assigned to an individual line item and is used for small or rounding differences. It's automatically posted to a small differences account, and we'll see an example in section 4. You can also set whether invoices can be automatically reduced, in which case the difference is posted to a clearing account and a credit memo generated to clear it. The check cashing time is added to the posting date of payment to give the fixed value date and is important if you're using cash management and forecasting. The duplicate invoice check will be explained on the next slide. Individual payment means that each invoice is paid separately, rather than by one bank transfer for the total if more than one invoice is due. House bank. This is the bank that the organisations make payments from and receive payments into. You only really need to enter it if you're paying different suppliers out of different banks. For example, you pay into company separately. Usually if there's more than one house bank, it's chosen automatically based on the payment method and ranking set in the configuration. But if required, it can be overwritten at supplier or document level. Clearing with customer means that if you're making a payment to a supplier, you can also deduct any outstanding items on the related customer account. But unless they both have the same business partner, you do have to link the customer in the vendor account and the vendor in the customer account, and select the clearing with vendor in the customer account. Linking the two also enables you to see the customer items when looking at the supplier line items, and the supplier line items when looking at the customer items. Be careful as the link between customer and vendor is at global level. So if you have a supplier with account number 12345, and in one company code you've created a customer 67890, and in another company you've created a different customer with a different number, you can only link one of the customers. Where an organisation has a lot of company codes, you really need to coordinate the creation of new suppliers and vendors to avoid duplicates. Withholding taxes are deducted from an invoice and paid directly to the tax office in certain cases. It's often used for suppliers who are individuals rather than corporate, based on local tax requirements. Withholding taxes can be deducted at the point of posting the invoice or at the point of making the payment. Again, this usually depends on the local regulations. You need to click on Create and select the correct withholding tax type and tax code. Back to the main screen, the final two areas are the contact area and the attachments. In this example, I've saved the supplier first and then created a contact, and then in the contacts area clicked on Create and entered the business partner number of the contact. You can also use the right arrow to enter more information such as function, department, date of birth, fax, internet address, etc. Under Attachments, by clicking on the plus button, you can attach documents. For example, you might want to add proof that the address or bank details are correct by attaching a letterhead from the supplier. If you are simply creating a vendor directly in the system, there are several apps that you can use. I will mainly be using the Supplier Master app shown on the left, as only the supplier options are shown as the default and not, for example, customer credit management. Currently, the name in the Fiori app library is slightly different to the name in the 1909 sandbox that I'm using, and you may find the layout is slightly different if you're using earlier versions. However, the fields should be much the same. The app on the right in the slide is similar, but instead of just allowing access to the supplier roles, also allows you to create customers and, for example, contacts and credit management roles as well. You can then navigate to the Manage Supplier or Customer Master Data apps to enter the specific master data detail against the role. I'm now going to go through the detail of some of the key fields that need to be completed for a standard supplier. And then after that, I'll put it all together in a quick demo. You can change which fields are mandatory, which fields are optional, and which fields are hidden in the configuration, although certain fields will always be mandatory. For example, the country, language, name, or description. The first screen of the Supplier Master is the Overview screen. You can use the filters to select the relevant existing suppliers, and you can use the Settings button to add additional columns, do more sorting, filtering and grouping, or export to Excel. To create a new supplier, you can either copy an existing supplier by selecting that supplier and pressing Copy, or you can create a new supplier from scratch by clicking on the Create button, which gives you the option of creating a person or an organisation. Note this is one area where Fiori is better, as you cannot easily copy a business partner in the GUI. If you choose Copy, you can choose to copy with the pre-selection, in which case you can choose which company code or purchasing organisation you wish to copy if there are more than one. The system will then copy any data that can be identical. To create a new supplier, the first thing to select is whether it's a person or an organisation. In this case, I've selected an organisation, but the pop-up for person would be similar. The next field to choose is the grouping. This dictates what the number range would be. I've chosen the internal or sequential numbering so that the system will assign the number automatically. But your organisation may have different rules, especially if external systems are involved, or they may use external numbering for intercompany, if using, for example, an alphanumeric code. As a minimum, you will need the name of the organisation, address and language. If you intend to post invoices to the supplier, you will need a company code and reconciliation account. And if you want to raise purchase orders, you'll need a purchasing organisation and order currency, as well as the related roles. You can only choose one role in this screen, but in the demo you'll be able to see how to select the second role. The one-time vendor functionality is also mentioned in section 4. Some organisations prefer to create an account for each supplier, and in any case, currently some of the new apps in SAP S4HANA do not support this functionality. So I've shown an example of the GUI transaction FB60 in the slide so that you can see an example of the pop-up to enter the address and bank details. If you're already using this functionality in previous versions of SAP and want to continue, or have a few suppliers you're only ever going to use once for something small, you can still create a generic account using the one-time vendor account grouping and account group. This allows you to leave the address and bank details blank in the master data and instead enter them when posting the invoice. The next screen allows you to enter more data that's applicable globally and to expand on the address information if required. Search terms are a good idea, although search functionality in Fiori is quite powerful anyway. You would normally use either a keyword, or you could use one of the search terms for the legacy supplier number. You may notice that in the sandbox I've used my initials so that I can quickly find all my suppliers in one go, although usually the created by field can be used for that instead. The authorization group can be used to restrict access to certain users for that business partner. The alternative payee is generally used when payments made to a different organisation, for example a financing company. In this case it's at global level, but you can have an alternative payee at company code level instead. You can either scroll down or use the tabs to jump directly to different areas. In the industry section, you can set up different industries in the configuration if required for reporting. And in the supplier information section, there is additional information you can enter, such as a link to the customer account. The supplier number on the slide is blank because in this setup it's the same as the business number, which has not yet been assigned, as I've not saved the supplier yet, and the account group usually defaults in. The supplier authorization group is freely definable in customizing and allows you to extend the authorization for specific objects. Payment blocks are available if you want to amend or check something or get an approval before the supplier is used. The international location number is used mainly in Germany. If I scroll down to the roles, you can see that in addition to the global role that we're in, there's only one additional role created, which is the company code or finance role. But here you can click on Create to choose the purchasing role or even amend the validity period. There are sections further down the screen to enter more company code or purchasing organisation specific data, which we'll look at shortly. Below that I can fill in more address information if I didn't already do that in the first pop-up screen. The standard communication section is fairly self-explanatory. If most communications, for example purchase orders, are sent out in the language where the company code is based, in this case English, you would normally put that language regardless of where the supplier is based. If you have a lot of suppliers who use a different language and you've created forms in those languages, you can enter the other languages here instead. You can choose validity periods for addresses rather than just overwriting the existing one if the supplier changes addresses. And if you click on the arrow and go into the additional address details screen, you can also assign an address type, for example home address, business address, holiday home, etc. This is sometimes tricky if the supplier supplies to several company codes in different countries, particularly where the currency is different. As often the bank accounts are different, and the bank account information is at global level, not at company code level. If the supplier only has one bank account, the system ID type usually defaults to 0001, so you just need to enter the country of the bank, not the supplier, bank key and account number. If the bank has already been created, you can just select it from the drop-down list. If it does not exist, you need to enter the country and then choose the blue arrow on the right of the line to go to the details to enter the bank name. In Europe, in particular, you will also need the IBAN number. The next section is the identification. To select a new identification, choose Create and then select the drop-down. In this slide, you can see the various options that you can use for identification, and you can use more than one if necessary by creating additional ones from the main screen. Once you've selected an ID type, the system automatically goes back to the main screen for you to enter an identification number, responsible institution, and validity period where relevant. The tax number category ID is similar, although usually a VAT number. It is specific to each country and may also be an income tax number, national insurance number, provincial or state tax numbers, NIP, SIREN, SIRET, etc., depending on the country, and again you can have more than one. In the Purchasing Organisation section, I can add additional purchasing organisations by clicking on the Create button, and I can click on the arrow on the right to get to more detail. The Company Code section is similar. I can extend the supplier into more company codes, or use the right arrow to go into more detail of the company code fields. In the documentation, SAP refers to some of these sections as facets. You can also use the copy at facet function for areas such as company codes or purchasing organisations, as well as address and bank details. To copy a company code, for example, if I want to create a new company code as a copy of OF01 in the slide, I select that company and then click Copy. The additional details will open up for me to assign a new company code and check the copy details and, if necessary, amend or fill any fields that need correcting. In this screen, we can see the additional details for the purchasing organisation, most of which should be fairly self-explanatory or are more relevant to purchasing than finance. The two most important fields from a finance point of view are probably the order currency, which ideally should be the same as the invoice currency, and the payment terms. You'll notice that the payment terms field appears in two places, in the company code details and the purchasing organisation details, and can be different in both places, as well as different for different company codes and purchasing organisations, depending what's been agreed. The payment terms in the purchasing organisation section refer only to logistics invoices, in other words, invoices that are posted against a purchase order, and the company code payment terms are only relevant for invoices that are posted as a finance document, in other words, without a purchase order.